Does wind power provide one or more of the grid demand elements? No again. The brief answer is it does not truly provide base load, load following, or peak load power. Note that electricity must be used immediately as there is no economical storage, and that supply and demand must be balanced every second. Since this is an important issue, we'll look at it a bit closer. First type of user demand is called base load. This is the predictable underlying electricity requirement needed 24/7, 365. Can wind power provide this? No, as no one can guarantee any amount of wind energy 24/7, 365. The principal base loads sources of electric power are nuclear and coal facilities. And coal, of course, emits 85% of the electrical sector's CO2. But since wind energy can't provide baseload power, it will not replace any baseload facilities. So what this means is 85% of the electrical sector's CO2 emissions won't be really reduced by wind energy. On the other hand, nuclear or geothermal facilities do provide baseload, so they can replace these high-emitting coal facilities. The second type of demand is called load following. This predictably goes up and down each day with more electricity being used before people go to work and after they come home. Can wind power provide this? No, because it doesn't provide electricity on this type of cycle. The last type of demand is called peak load. This refers to the unpredictable spikes that can be caused by a variety of situations like more air conditioning on a hot day. Can wind power be depended on to be able to respond to such unexpected events? No, because we have zero assurance that wind would be available on these unscheduled times. I know there's a lot to read here, and that's why it's all online for a look at more closely. The main load following and peak load sources of electrical power are hydroelectric, gas, and specialized small coal facilities. Since wind energy can't really provide load following or peak load, it is used to reduce the need, but not eliminate, hydro, gas, and small coal units. The most important thing here to remember is that when wind replaces hydro, there are zero CO2 savings, and when wind replaces gas or small coal, there's only tiny CO2 savings. The main reason for these low savings is due to what's called thermal inefficiencies, which means that the gas or small coal units are just operating very inefficiently, ramping up and down, just like your car does in stop-and-go city traffic. We'll end this part by showing you a real-world demand curve on top in red and a typical wind supply curve. Note how the two are completely unmatched. Okay, criteria number 5. Is wind power compact? No, as mentioned before, to even approximate the nameplate power of a conventional facility like nuclear, it takes something like 1,000 times the amount of area. An analysis by a Canadian expert concluded it's more like 2,000 times. Promoters are now trying to convince gullible politicians that wind power can have some real capacity value, an important grid ingredient. Their tinker-toy trick is to connect multiple wind projects spread out over vast areas, often several states. This amounts to massive redundancy, which completely undermines the objective to be a concentrated power source. Their proposal is to build the same capacity serving the same market in several different places, and when that inevitably fails, build more. Best analogy I can come up with is this is like something like you buying 10 cheap cars, figuring that one of them will likely work when you need it. Not only would this be a huge pain to work with, but it would cost you much more money than buying one quality vehicle due to the expense of extra storage, insurance, etc. Another liability of wind power is that most of the windiest sites and available land are a long way from where the electricity is needed. This will result in thousands of miles of huge unsightly transmission towers at an enormous expense to taxpayers and ratepayers, most of it completely unnecessary. And there are other negative impacts besides, like the cost of transmitting wind power is 2 to 3 times that for conventional power, the 10% power loss for every 60 plus or so miles, the potential health effects from EMS, etc. And don't be fooled about what you hear concerning the smart grid. Its main reason for existence is to enable wind energy. Does wind power provide economical electricity? Nope. It's considerably more expensive than any of our prime conventional sources. Let's look at it from 3 perspectives. We'll start by considering what I'll call total cost. This would include initial construction for capital cost, plus the subsequent operation and maintenance costs, plus the cost of fuel to run the power plant. I'm referring here to a 2009 study by the government that was based on each source generating the same amount of electricity. As you can see, nuclear has the lowest total cost and wind the highest. Note that although the cost of dealing with spent fuel was included for nuclear, the cost of decommissioning wind power was not included. The wind power figures also do not include other extras it requires, like backup generation, initial transmission lines needed, etc., etc. The bottom line is that wind is much worse than it appears here. The second cost perspective is taxpayer subsidies. Costs reported by wind energy lobbyists usually ignore the enormous amounts of financial incentives they receive beforehand. This 2008 EIA report, Energy Information Agency, federal agency, is just some of the federal benefits, shows the stark differences. But wait, it's actually worse. Here's the 2011 version of that same report. We go back to show you the prior one. That was 2008. This is now 2010. Wind energy lobbies used to rationalize this away and say, well, the total amounts that are paid for coal and stuff, they're more. So forget this per megawatt hour business. Well, here's the latest figures for totals. This is not per megawatt hour. Reality is that the total wind subsidies, federal subsidies for wind energy, are more than the combined total of all other conventional power sources. Combined total. To get a more accurate picture of this situation, we also have to look at the state incentives, which are in addition to the federal ones. So there's an even greater discrepancy here. And if this already fanatical giveaway wasn't enough, recently there's some 200 bills pending before the U.S. Congress that included additional incentives for some type of alternative energy, mostly wind power. The bottom line of this unparalleled generosity is that investors like T. Boone Pickens make some 25% profit from wind energy, essentially government guaranteed, and that oil companies like BP have become wind power investors because it helps them avoid paying most income taxes. Consider this fact. The company that pioneered using wind power to avoid taxes was Enron. All of this is from a taxpayer's perspective. How about now looking at wind power's effect on electric utility ratepayers? Here's a graph looking at some representative countries. This data came from the IEA, that's International Energy Agency, and is a levelized cost comparison. There are two variables here. The costs per kilowatt hour in US cents are the dark bars, which is compared to the percentage of wind power produced in the red part. You don't have to study these too much to realize that the higher amount of wind power, the higher the cost of electricity to the consumer. Denmark holds the distinction of having the highest percentage of wind power implementation in the developed world, while also having the highest cost of electricity. Strangely, when you read that Denmark has been successful in setting up a lot of wind power, you almost never hear that their electricity cost is over 3 times what ours is. This is the direction our current representatives are going, and they know that this cost information. Their solution is to try to raise the cost of the United States' other electrical power, for instance by taxing carbon, so that wind power will then seem more affordable. As informative as that is, I want you to see the ratepayer cost of electricity for those same countries compared to their use of what I'm calling good renewables. The primary ones that I'm calling good are hydroelectric, geothermal, and nuclear. We'll discuss why nuclear in a minute. Not surprisingly, again, it's an almost perfect correlation, this time in the opposite direction. The more good renewables used by the country, the green part, the lower the cost to consumers. This is not the direction we're going in. Well, what's the impact of higher electricity rates? Is it just financial nuisance? No, not really. This slide shows, for instance, there's a strong correlation to quality of life and the cost of electricity. By making energy more expensive, we're going backwards. So just remember, the next time you hear that wind power is providing us with economical energy, make sure that the promoter is addressing all three of these areas: total costs, taxpayer costs, and ratepayer costs. Of course, if they really did, then they wouldn't be making such claims in the first place. Okay, so our seventh point, last point here. Does wind power make a consequential reduction to CO2? No. Despite over 100,000 industrial wind machines encumbering the planet, no fossil fuel plants have been closed. Many new ones have been built, and many more are in the offing. Despite this large number, 100,000 plus, no independent scientific study has ever proven that wind power saves a meaningful amount of CO2. In fact, the most independent scientific study done by the National Academy of Sciences says the opposite. Their 2007 report concludes that, assuming the most optimistic conditions, the United States CO2 savings by 2020 will amount to only 1.8%. An earlier EIA study for Congress concluded that the amount was about 1.3%. A later 2007 EIA study said the best case savings by 2030 would be 2.7%. These are trivial quantities. I have a few slides here to try to help you see CO2, a very important matter, and another good perspective. Let's start by looking at which countries are doing well with CO2 and which are not. A good way to do this assessment is to consider the CO2 produced per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. In that regard, France is the #1 country in the world. Best. That might not surprise most people, but this sure should. Denmark, we are told, is a model to emulate, is actually the worst modern country in the world regarding CO2 per kilowatt hour. The worst. This next slide gives you the idea of just how much atmosphere there is above us. Note the height of Mount Everest over in the lower right-hand corner. Then there's the matter of what is the composition of this air. As you can see, nitrogen is about 78%, oxygen 21%, and argon 1%. Everything else combined, including CO2, is much less than 1%. Everything else. This graph of CO2 sources should help you see the CO2 situation was not just a U.S. matter in its proper perspective. For starters, the global man-made commercial part is small, only about 4%. There are also sinks of CO2, the opposite of sources, but this is even a less understood part of the carbon balancing process. In fact, experts in the field acknowledge that some 30% of what goes on with CO2 sinks is unknown. This is a highly astounding percentage. Another way to look at it is to say, let's collect all the air in the atmosphere into one large cylinder and make it a mile high. Just how much are we talking about changing for the several $1 trillion that we and other countries are planning on spending? Out of that mile-high cylinder, 1/4 of an inch. Here are perspectives that you won't be seeing from the media. A study concluded that insects produce something like 10 times the CO2 that human-related activities do. And over 90% of all the CO2 saved in the last 35 years is due to using nuclear power. Very little due to renewables. And look how the cost of CO2 savings compare. As you can see, cost of saving a pound of CO2 for using wind is 13 times as much as it is for saving a pound of CO2 using nuclear. Okay, here's where we're going to take a break.